this plenary session on changing global monetary landscapes. So over the past few years, the world has experienced one of the most drastic shifts in monetary policy environment in decades. From the fight against post-pandemic inflation to today's increasingly uncertain global outlook, central banks are facing a far more complex set of challenges than many had anticipated. Inflation remains a concern in many economies, yet policy responses are becoming increasingly diverse. At the same time, physical pressures, technological disruption, and geopolitical tensions, and the changing pattern of global trades constantly are reshaping the environment while monetary policy operates. So these raise a set of questions. Will these factors lead to a fundamental transformation of the global monetary landscape? Are we entering a more fragmented global financial system? What are the implications for the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world, including the emerging market? These questions are exactly what we're going to explore today, and we're really fortunate to have three distinguished speakers, and each of them can give a 45-minute talk alone, but we have three of them. So each will have 15 minutes to do their talk, and then in the end we'll have 20 minutes roughly Q&As. So first, Professor James Fodor. Professor James Fodor has taught economics and occasionally politics at Oxford University. I don't know whether today he's more on the economic side or political side, since 1993. For most of that time, his research has been in the history of economic theory. Actually, we have two historians here, particularly in relation to the mid-20th century debate over inflation and macroeconomic management. He's a fellow of Balliol College. Hopefully I didn't butcher that word.
That's great.
Thank you. Professor Barry Eichengreen. Professor Eichengreen is George C. Party and Helen N. Party Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics and Political Science at University of California, Berkeley. He's a research associate of NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow of the CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research. And last but not least, Professor Ahmed Farouk Ahsan. Professor Ahsan is a professor at the College of Islamic Studies, Hamad bin Khalifa University, Qatar. He previously served as a board member and monetary policy committee member of the Central Bank of the Republic of Turkey, and he has held academic policy positions in several international institutions. His research focused on monetary economics, Islamic finance, financial innovation, digital currencies, and so on. Of course, the political economy of development. All three of them have published very widely in academic journals, and they also have book chapters on finance, central banking, and financial markets. Without further ado, I'm going to go with my author, Professor James Fodor. Please go ahead. 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I can start with clearing up the question whether it's economics or politics. I don't think it's either. I begin with my apology. 20 years ago, I became a historian of economic thought, and I'm no economist. I study the past of theory, so don't ask me about economics today, or for that matter, the economy. However, I have once upon a time worked on central bank independence, and it seems to me that there were some questions re-emerging after the central bank independence swept the world in the 1980s and 90s, really, just when I was writing my thesis. So I thought we might revisit some of those. Now I find my own early writing catches history, so here we are. Legitimate and illegitimate challenges, I don't talk about. Legitimate challenges, it seems to me there are plenty of these. Nonsense from the 1980s, it diplomatically says. I thought that the advocacy of independence in the 1980s and the 1990s was extremely poor quality. So I've listed here some of the things that upset me. These people were testing the benefits of independence by measuring independence. They were measuring independence by reading statutes. No economist would do that. It's not what the book says. If the law says the producer pays a tax, you don't stop there. And you wonder, does it get passed on to the consumers, don't you? That's how we do economics. So the statutes do not determine the incentives, so they do not determine the behaviour. I wondered, where are the cases of central banks defying governments? It's very hard to find a proper fight that would actually show independence. Ben Bernanke's book from a few years ago, 21st Century Monetary Policy, it's called, turned out to be a wonderful source for finding out about how the case for independence has fared. He actually says Paul Volcker was independent because of his personality and the support of the presidents. Now, it's a very funny kind of independence where you have support of the presidents. This is the lesson he drew from it. Non-political policy we were supposed to have. Well, Bernanke again, we need to make our case to a broader public. What case was that? That was the case that they ought to be independent. Well, that is a political case then. That's not a non-political actor. The theory of credibility, well, here we go. I could talk economic theory here. Under what circumstances does the private sector believe what they're being told by the central bank? This was always about the theory of it, which appears to make a case, or is presented as making a case for independence. Is in fact theory about an entity called the policymaker. People will read what the theory says. It's the policymaker this, the policymaker that. The policymaker has this problem. That is the credibility problem. People changing the identity of the policymaker doesn't change anything. And sure enough, we find in Bernanke talking about the importance of forward guidance and explaining how they have this problem. You've got to explain, you persuade people about what your policy is going to be, but they've every incentive not to believe you. So it said bank independence, in Bernanke's view, he doesn't see it this way, his description of the facts says it didn't provide credibility. He doesn't, as I say, he doesn't see these as challenges to independence. I'm just lining up his book from a few years ago with what was said when people were advocating independence. Well, deprecation of democracy, I don't approve of it, but there you are. Legitimate challenges, well, one of the things that's around in Britain and the United States anyway is questioning of expertise. Will the time told what to do by experts in one way or another? Well, I think there's some legitimate questions about that. Remember the Great Moderation, I'm sorry to keep going on about Bernanke, but there you are. The Great Moderation was the prelude to the financial crisis, wasn't it? And who was it was telling us it was a great moderation? So then we have the financial crisis and we have re-regulation of the banking sector. It turns out re-regulation's gone too far, so we learn in Britain. Our Labour government's been rolling it back slightly, probably rightly. But I don't know whether the experts can get regulation right. The point of that is not directly on central bank independence, but it points to scepticism about expertise. So does COVID, the COVID itself, COVID policy was expert guided, and I think very poor. Doesn't much matter what I think. A lot of people think it was very poor. A lot of people resent the way they were bossed around for no apparent benefit. And the inflation that followed, it's very noticeable to me that the British monetarists I'm thinking of have gone right off independence. They say the central banks caused the inflation that everybody else says was caused by the war in Ukraine. The central banks caused it by expanding the money supply 2 years earlier. Well, they might have a case. Ukraine war didn't cause inflation in Switzerland. Why not? And I was most disinterested with the Bank of England and their plain intervention in politics, I thought, with some rather poor forecasts about what the result of Brexit would be. So each time, failures, experts, do we want experts telling us? And I invite you to see this in the public mind, not in my, I'm not particularly advocating this view, although I can see merit in it, but see it in the public mind. Well, one of the things said in the 80s was that monetary policy is about inflation, and that's all. And so we can, this is one of the responses to the question about democratic legitimacy. They say, well, it's only, monetary policy causes, determines inflation. You can see, you can tell the central bank what inflation you want, 2% say, and you can see whether it delivers it. And so you've got a kind of accountability there. You know whether it's getting it right, getting it wrong. And monetary policy doesn't do anything else. In particular, people said it doesn't affect employment. But somehow the fact that it doesn't affect employment or doesn't affect employment in the long run was good enough for it doesn't affect anything else. Well, that's silly, isn't it? Because German monetary union and European monetary union, but monetary policy matters. I would think they probably show the absence of some of the Bundesbank didn't want monetary union, but they got it. That might just be the absence of independence. Independence is not so easy to secure, even if you think you want it. But certainly, problems with it. Would you want to have a central bank that could veto joining a monetary union? On the face of it, that's what independence is. Well, modern monetary theory, so-called, I could talk a bit about this as well. I don't know if people recognise it. It's a story about it being impossible for the government to have excessive debt, primarily, as the centrepiece of it. And it's had some traction with the Democratic Party in the United States and the Green Party in the United Kingdom, I don't know where else. And it's problematic because, although parts of it are crazy, parts of it are entirely sensible. And one of the things they say is you shouldn't worry about the central bank running out of money. And this, the relevance of that goes to the interaction of fiscal and monetary policy. I'm thinking of the QE case. We had to have the Treasury guarantee the central bank wouldn't suffer any losses from the QE operation. Well, central bank losing money is a funny thing, really. And it invites us to think of disaggregated policy making, which can't be the right way of thinking of things. And modern monetary theory people, I think, got this right. So there's a challenge to the view that you want to think of monetary and fiscal policy as somehow separate and needing to compete or be controlled or something. Same thing again, Bernanke explains how the Fed needed to campaign to get legislation passed to deal with the financial crisis, campaign with Congress. Well, it's a funny kind of independence again. It's leading the campaign for political measures. Anyway, it doesn't have the power to do the things it's trying to do. That's a very odd sort of independence. We'd be better off again accepting the interconnections, the interrelatedness of policy tools, and stop trying to tell ourselves that some of them are hived off over there, being run separately. Monetary policy is not just about inflation. Well, what about wealth distribution? And one of the things that I hear all the time is how terrible it is that sometimes it's distribution of income, but quite often distribution of wealth has become so skewed. Well, why has that happened? Well, asset prices have gone up. Well, central banks played a role in that, didn't they? Low interest rate policy. So how can it be that this is non-political or it's policy which is unrelated to anything except inflation? Of course it's related to other things. And by the way, the Bank of England has various things in its so-called remit, helping a transition to a net zero economy. So I don't know why that would be there, but apparently that's a government monetary policy capacity. So, illegitimate challenge. Now the legitimate challenges interest me because they do make a case. I was arguing this case in the 90s and sort of gave up. But it seems to me today there are illegitimate challenges as well. The foolish end of modern monetary theory is one of them, using that theory to dismiss the idea that there were real resource limits, or a way to avoid facing the idea that there were real resource limits. It's a nightmare. The fiscal outcomes, I'm thinking the illegitimate challenge is to think that we're going to solve fiscal problems, overuse of resources, the government spending too much money, and the private sector trying to spend too much, more than is possible. The threat of the fiscal deficits and the debts we have leading to stories that it can be fixed by monetary policy, that does worry me. Growth outcomes, same thing. Growth very slow. What about somebody saying, quite wrongly, that it's a central bank stop? I think quite wrongly. Some people say, what about that? I noticed the demand for public services in the UK anyway doesn't stop growing when the economy stops growing. So there's a real tension coming there somewhere. And we see, we have seen, haven't we, from the unmentionable person discussed in the previous session, an aggressive unilateralism, a new aggressive unilateralism in trade policy. Well, what about monetary policy? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine somebody saying, we've got the monetary power here, we want to use this for our diplomatic purposes? There's a dollar liquidity club, as some people call it, which comes from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve extends liquidity to other countries. What if that becomes a diplomatic matter? Surely that would be a challenge to independence. Could market intervention even be a policy weapon? I don't know. I think I know somebody who, if he ever thought of it, might believe it could. And there's a challenge to independence, which would be a very bad thing. So, we have, in my last minute and 15 seconds, we have good and bad reasons for rejecting independence. We also have some narcissistic and self-aggrandizing leaders, though they're more popular than my friends think they ought to be. Well, my friends have given up deprecating democracy the way they did in the 90s. Now they deprecate populists. Well, it's awfully much like the same thing. And it doesn't seem to work. I noticed that the populists carry on doing quite well, even though my friends deprecate them. And I see in this story some motivations that they might have for undermining independence, and some good arguments that are not their arguments, that they're there, lurking. And that, to me, that's a problematic and, at the end of the day, I suppose, dangerous combination. I'm no fan of independence, but I certainly don't want to see it overturned for all the wrong reasons. So that's my reflection on changing monetary environment. Some future historian could sort of draw on. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Professor Barry H. Green.
James took the clicker?
Oh. Sorry. Just trying to get one up on you there, Barry.
So it had not been my intention to talk about central bank independence, but I cannot resist telling a story that I think, if I understood correctly, illustrates the previous speaker's point. It comes from July of 1979. You will recall that was when Jimmy Carter reshuffled his cabinet and he moved G. William Miller from the Fed chairmanship to the Treasury secretaryship. And he considered appointing this very tall central banker, Paul Volcker, chairman of the Fed. he invited Volcker into the Oval Office to have a discussion about what kind of policies Volcker would follow. Volcker, Carter later said, disrespectfully draped his very long leg over the arm of one of the two Oval Office couches and said, you know, I will not follow the same policies as that guy, where he was referring to the inflationary policies of Miller before him. Carter had been told by Bert Lance that if he appointed Volcker, he would lose the 1980 election because of the high interest rate disinflationary policies that Volcker would implement. And Carter, for the good of the country, he later claimed, appointed Volcker anyway and duly lost the election. So I think this illustrates the point that the independence of the Fed is not rooted in how the board is structured or the budget, independent budget the Fed has, but rather the personality of the Fed chair, in this case Volcker, and the fact that Carter went ahead and supported it anyway, even though he knew it would put his re-election at risk. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I do want to talk about the topic of this session, the problem being that the title of this session evolved over time. There were several different incarnations of the title, and this is the one that existed when I put the PowerPoint presentation together. It's the question of what is happening to our monetary and financial system, and how should Asian economies respond. So I would like you to suspend disbelief for a moment and imagine an end to the current international monetary and financial system organized around the dollar, the US correspondent banking system, and SWIFT. It's arguable whether or not this system is ending, but suspend disbelief for a moment. The question then is, how should Asian governments, central banks, and societies respond? How should they position themselves to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs of this transition? So that's how I attempted to translate the title of this session into a little intellectual agenda. Turns out to be easier said than done. When you begin to unpack it a little bit, you realize that trying to identify those costs and benefits of whatever regime succeeds the current is difficult to do. You have to worry about to whom they will accrue. You have to ask whether Asia is even a relevant unit for thinking about responding to the end of dollar dominance. You have to recall that Asian countries not only differ, there are differences between Asian economies, there are differences within Asian economies. They are not monolithic. What the banking system prefers may not be what other stakeholders prefer, so forth and so on. All of this is occurring against the backdrop of rapid changes in monetary and financial technology that are hard to get your mind around and understand. And finally, I think the question of what comes after dollar dominance is not independent of how and why dollar dominance. What's your scenario for how and why dollar dominance comes to an end? So the alternatives, as I see them, are 6. Relying on the other currencies of economies that already have relatively well-developed financial systems, and the euro area and the euro. Can Japan and the yen step up and fill the void created by the loss of dollar dominance in this scenario? Second possibility is the creation of an Asian rival to the dollar and the US correspondent banking system, and I'm thinking here specifically of China's cross-border interbank payments system, which is structured very much along the lines of the US correspondent banking system and a messaging system akin to SWIFT. Digital update to that Chinese system, bringing it meaningfully into the 21st century. Project Enbridge, which people in this region will probably know about. Project Agora, which people in this region probably will not know about. And finally, stablecoins, which are de rigueur in the United States. Singapore as a stablecoin ordinance as well. Is this something that should be taken seriously and pursued more widely? So relying on currencies like the euro and the yen, I think it is obvious that neither of them have the scale and the attributes needed to substitute for the dollar at scale. The euro lacks an installed base of safe assets comparable to AAA rated treasury securities out there in the hands of the public already. So US treasuries are on the order of 40 trillion. AAA rated government bonds of euro area sovereigns are on the order of 3.5 trillion. There are only 3 euro area sovereigns with AAA ratings from all the major rating agencies. If you want to look at foreign exchange turnover, which is people obtaining the currencies of third countries in order to make payments, they go through the dollar. Forex turnover in euro is 25% of the global total. The dollar accounts for 90% of the global total. Global total is 200% because there are 2 currencies involved in every trade. Japan lags even further behind. The yen accounts for only 5% of global reserves compared to the dollar's 57%. It accounts for only 17% of global forex turnover, again compared to the dollar's 90%. As I write here, that's what a quarter century of stagnation will do. And now people who want to hold and use the yen face the prospect of holding and using a currency that is losing value secularly over time. What about China's cross-border interbank payments system? Participation and settlement volume through this system, which has been in existence since 2015, patterned very much around the way correspondent banking is organized in the US. Settlement volume had been growing at like 30 or 40% a year until last year, when it grew by 1% over the calendar year. So enthusiasm for this system has died down quite a bit. If you want to do transactions in Chinese RMB through SIPs, you presumably want to hold RMB balances so that you can make and receive payments. If you want to use those balances, you have to ask the permission of the PBOC because of Chinese regulation, capital controls, lack of market liquidity, all that. I'm not convinced. I'm not sure the Chinese authorities are convinced by their achievement either, because at the beginning of this year, they added 2 SIPs, cross-border ECNY transfer services, CBEX platform, where this is a blockchain-based platform for making transfers between banks without having to go through, correspondent bank A calls up correspondent bank B, presumably in another country, and makes a renminbi payment. This obviates the need for the correspondent chain and the phone calls. By putting all this stuff on blockchain, it appears to accommodate tokenized bank deposits as well as central bank digital currency. But I think the question remains, how quickly will it see take-up? So last month, we saw the first batch of Chinese banks and a handful of foreign banks from Singapore, from Laos, Thailand, Qatar, and the UAE and Brazil signed agreements to participate, to use CBEX. So again, that's a small handful of banks compared to the thousands of banks that use CIPS and the renminbi, and the many thousands of banks that use the US correspondent banking system and the dollar. Project Enbridge, this is a digital platform once upon a time whose construction was guided by the BIS, which stepped out. So now this is a China-led project, code written in the Digital Institute of the PBOC, involving the monetary authorities of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. It does not, so far as I can tell, accommodate tokenized bank deposits, but it accommodates transfers of central bank digital currency. 95% of the actual transfers that have been made are in RMB. It is operational, but it hasn't been scaled up, and I think the challenge is to scaling it up are not technological. The code works, but they're political. Our decisions about governance and regulation are going to be made. With 5 central banks, you can make decisions by consensus. You can argue until somebody's exhausted. When you have 105 central banks, you need a voting rule, and that's going to be problematic. Project Agora is really the same thing, but it's a project of other central banks that are not politically aligned with China. So it involves the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Korea. Why it doesn't involve the Monetary Authority of Singapore is an interesting question. I don't know. And the usual Western suspects, but also the Bank of Mexico, SWIFT, which kind of sees the digital writing on the wall that it needs a modern alternative to correspondent banking. This is only a prototype. It hasn't actually been used in transactions, but it could be used. Although, just like Western banks, Western central banks are unlikely to join Enbridge, a China-led project. China is probably unlikely to join a Western-led project. And finally, stablecoins. I have my doubts about whether they will be stable. They could be subject to bank run problems. Whether they will be fungible. If Amazon issues a coin, will you be able to use Amazon coin at Walmart and Walmart coin at Amazon? And I think there are fundamental legal obstacles to take-up of stablecoins. If the transaction goes to the wrong wallet, who do you sue? Do you sue the issuer of the stablecoin, the exchange on which the stablecoin moved, the validator, someone else? Far from clear. That's why corporations seem hesitant about going in this direction. So my conclusion is that CIPS is limited by the limited liquidity of renminbi reserves. Committing to something like Project Enbridge means committing to a China-led project, not attractive to a variety of Western central banks and governments. Relying on economies with well-developed financial and payment systems like Europe and Japan is possible, but they lack the scale and other attributes to substitute for the dollar. Committing to something like Project Agora, I think it is an interesting possibility, although you can't really commit to a prototype. And a substantial part of Asia, namely China, is unlikely to move in that direction. So my bottom line, last slide, is that I think none of the available responses to my imagined hypothetical scenario of the end of dollar dominance is optimal. There are limitations to all of the available alternatives. Not terribly surprising conclusion. And secondly, some of the constraints that limit these alternatives from substituting more fully for the dollar presumably can be relaxed over time, and we have to hope that the relevant authorities move faster to relax those constraints.
Last speaker, Ahmed.
Thank you very much. It is my great privilege to speak in this distinguished panel, especially in front of and together with Barry Ayhan-Green, because I started working on economics with the web page of Barry Ayhan-Green back in 1997, 1998. He had a wonderful website about the East Asian crisis. And I was an undergrad student at Boğaziçi University. It was my 4th year. And we were writing, and my professor has offered me to write a paper about comparing East Asian crisis, Mexican crisis, and the Turkish crisis of 1994. And we benefited a lot from the Barry Ayhan-Green's webpage on the East Asian crisis. And I certainly followed him later. And then 2 years ago, we were together at the CBDC workshop in Istanbul. It was a great privilege. Thank you again for the very kind invitation to Professor Üstün putting me into this panel. I was preparing my slides, on the first day I realized that it is better to have some interactive sessions. So I wanted to just talk. And this session reminded me of one of my first presentation in Singapore Economic Association meetings. I was a board member of Turkish Central Bank, and the Turkish Central Bank after the 2008 crisis started implementing some macroprudential policies, and we were shown as an example for leading emerging market country in trying different macroprudential policies, and it was quite successful. The issue at that time was to reduce the capital inflows due to the very low interest rate environment globally, and then we acted, instead of capital control, we acted some unconventional monetary policies to reduce the capital flows. And it reminds me of this discussion also, because all the central bank independence discussion also quite relevant to what we have done in after 2008 crisis. Because the central banks, and this is increasingly more I start thinking in the last couple of months, the central banks start assuming more roles. In the past, the central banking was relatively more conventional, easier. It was mainly price stability and the financial stability. Originally, Professor Ahengrin has a very nice book recently came out on the history of money, somewhat starting early on to cryptocurrencies, stable coins. But mainly central banking was originally for financial stability. It was not for price stability. There were, the banks started issuing bonds. There were lots of money, in a sense, issued by the banks, and the central banks were trying to regulate these different types of bonds issued by the banks such that there will be financial stability. That was the main purpose of central banking. Later on, we start having these inflation issues, and especially in the emerging market, global south, the issues start to be more of a price stability, and we forget the kind of financial stability. But the 2008 crisis reminds us. Why I want to bring this right now, the central banks start assuming much more roles after 2008 crisis. In the past, it was more of a conventional setup, and the main central banking theory was there are politicians and the central bankers, and there is an issue of time commitment. I mean, both of their purpose probably is good in the long run, and they care about the welfare of the society, but the politicians want to be re-elected. Not everybody is like Carter, so Carter seems to be a certain exception as a politician. But oftentimes politicians would like to be re-elected, and they relatively care less about the central bank independence. And that's why most of the central banking literature has been relying on the central bank independence literature. But it has changed, because the central banks start having multiple objectives. Right now, in current setup, and also the objectives have different durations. Certainly in the short run, the objectives are price stability, financial stability, but as Professor Ahengrin has presented, now there are certain structural changes, like what might happen if the dollar dominance is lost, and what will happen to this structural payment things, like should we be involved in the CBDC discussions, stablecoin discussions, should be part of this Ambridge project, Agora projects, should we collaborate more with the AIS project. So there are different objectives of central banks. Certainly in the short run, still the price stability and financial stability matters, and the growth for sure, even though it is not explicitly stated for the developing countries, it is there in the Federal Reserve case, but for most of the developing countries, the objectives are generally stated as price stability mainly, and then the financial stability. That's why I want to rely on two things. I want to bring you to the contemporary discussions, because currently the central banks are facing two problems. But the main theme in these two problems is uncertainties. There are two uncertainties, which is geopolitical uncertainty and the political uncertainty, political economy-related uncertainties, which is affecting globally all the countries, for sure. And the other uncertainty is about the technology. This AI revolution, AI-related uncertainties. I will come to this And I believe the first one is affecting the developing countries, this geopolitical uncertainty and uncertainty about the policymakers or the politicians of the developed world, especially Trump, is affecting the global south, developing countries, more than the second uncertainty, which is the AI uncertainty. So I will come to this. And for the first one, there are also different types of developing countries. Some developing countries are still fighting with inflation, like Argentina, like Turkey. And this, for them, the main priority is really price stability. In Turkey right now, for example, in Turkey we have 32% of inflation. In Argentina it is even more. These are rare cases, I know. But in most of the developing countries, there is still a fear that inflation may be rising very quickly. That's what we observe, for example, in Indonesia, right? Because of this global uncertainty and increasing oil prices start getting more than $100, and Bank Indonesia, or the Indonesian inflation rate rose up to 3.5 from 2.5, and even they had to abandon some of the subsidies related with the oil prices. And there is a possibility of increasing inflation. And given that developing countries have relatively lack of credibility and they don't have the same luxury like US. In the US, you can make some mistakes, and given that like before 2008 crisis, and you can have the luxury of correcting it later on. But given that the developing countries have a long period of high inflation and they have relatively lower credibility, they are much more concerned about the inflation. Once the inflation got out of the control, it might be very difficult to bring it back, and Turkey is a very good example for that. I remember I left the position when the inflation rate was a single-digit number, and then we started to have double-digit numbers of inflation, and on top of it, our inflation rate rise up to 80%. So very quickly, you can lose control of inflation. And now, after a long period of the last 3 years, is like a stabilization policy in Turkey, but we achieved to reduce it to 32%. So it is very easy to lose control over inflation, but it is also very difficult to bring it back to the normal. Still, imagine after 3 years, we have only reduced the inflation to 32%. So that's why the first uncertainty, global uncertainty related with the geopolitics, related with the Trump, related with the irresponsible actions of some of the politicians in the global north, is actually affecting the developing countries are even different. If your inflation rate is high already, then you are even more affected because you are already vulnerable. When you have like 30% double-digit number inflation, then you don't necessarily care about the other mechanisms. So that is one thing. There are other developing countries, they relatively maintain low inflation, like in India, like in Indonesia, like even in South Africa and so on, but still they are being affected. And I would like to remind you of the Arab Spring, right? Arab Spring mainly came because of the increasing oil prices. If you might remember, the oil prices rise up to even $150, and then they start reducing oil subsidies, other subsidies, the government starts having fiscal constraints, and then the uprising starts coming up. And then right now, the oil prices are about 100, and then we start observing certain social unrest in India and to a certain extent in other developing countries. So this is another objective. So when you have this sort of a social pressure, probably you don't care too much about the central bank independence, and there I do agree that the central bank independence become quite indigenous to the politicians and the zeitgeist of that time, or the soul of that time, where even the central bankers do not necessarily act in a harmonious way. But let me come to the second uncertainty. I believe it is even more interesting, because the first part is we pretty much know what might happen in developing countries, and certainly central banking is not safe for all the countries. There's a clear distinction for developed countries and developing countries, and the main distinction is that developed countries, especially the US, has the luxury of making mistakes. Even the luxury, even this mistake may cause like a global crisis of 2008, but still, given that US has a hegemonic currency, as a reserve currency and you issue, there is no original sin in the US case, they can manage it. But for developing countries, when there is a crisis, it is much more painful. And then certainly, Turkey is a very good example. We have recurrent crisis in 1994, 2000, 2001. We were relatively lucky afterwards. We managed to maneuver, but still there is a kind of a history of inflation and inflation inertia. It's not easy to claim that we may not have another big crisis. But let me come to the second uncertainty, which is more related with the global north, more related with the US especially. Because we always talk about this AI revolution. And right now, AI revolution is not for everyone. AI revolution is mainly for US, not even for you. Right? There will be productivity increases, this and that, but mainly, the main investor in the impact of AI revolution, we observe it in the demand increase. And the demand increase right now, yesterday, for example, there was a news that BlackRock and the Meta is investing $14 billion only for data centers, right? Only for data centers. And just remember this OpenAI cloud is investment. They're more than $1 trillion now. And this increases the demand for overall activities in the economy. So it is estimated that 1% of the global GDP, there's a recent BIS report, I like it very much. They look at the effects of AI investments on the global economy, and they say that 1% of the overall GDP comes from, or the investment of overall world GDP is like 1% of the global economy, which is a huge investment. So it has an immediate effect on the demand. But the problem is that, for central bankers, generally the shocks come from the demand side or from the supply side. Generally, if the shocks come from the two sides, there's an identification problem. And right now in the AI revolution, and this is mainly a policy uncertainty for US, there is a demand shock, which is a good thing, which people start investing through stock market, through raising funds from all over the world. This is a good thing, which the demand shifts to the right. So you can, as a reaction to the inflation, and in US right now, inflation rate is 3.5, not necessarily we are operating in a very low inflation environment. But at the same time, because of these investments, there will be a supply side shock. But the problem in the AI revolution, we don't know whether this supply productivity increase will come immediately. So it will probably take time. Or we don't know the time span. Probably it already came. Probably some of the companies are not employing people. Instead, they are benefiting from the AI tools, or even in robotics. But there is a big uncertainty about this demand and supply shifting at the same time. And then if the central bank or Federal Reserve do not identify this, there is a possibility of making a policy mistake. If, for example, they think that the demand side shock is high and it is leading to higher inflation, they might even increase the interest rates. Or if they think that the productivity shifts is supply shifts and productivity increases, they shouldn't be responding. Right? Even they should act in an opposite way. That's why this is not certain. And on top of it, there is a political uncertainty. With the new Fed chairman, they start not giving forward guidance. This might be one of the reasons, probably because of this AI uncertainty, since they don't identify, because we are economists and we are somewhat post-fact analysis. We look at the data, and from that, we really learn whether there is a supply side shock or the demand side shock or the both, and then we quantify them later on, and the data comes with certain lag, especially in the AI case with this structural change. Until that time, even I'm sure Federal Reserve is some sort of difficulty in predicting this, and there is an uncertainty in measurement. So that's why most likely Federal Reserve has abandoned this forward guidance with the current chairman. Probably there are political reasons as well, not to deal too much with Trump. That could be also a reason, but at the same time there's a technological reasons. And I believe that these two uncertainty will shape our future. But but these uncertainties are different for developing countries and developing countries. For developing countries, there is no AI revolution yet that much, and we don't expect that the productivity increase to take place immediately. But these two uncertainties, first one, global political uncertainty, will affect developing countries. And unfortunately, always central banking is not just about developing countries. Mainly developing countries are the price takers. US, Federal Reserve Act, and then others follow. And unfortunately, the one uncertainty is about irresponsible action of the US in geopolitics and also even in central banking. So it might affect the developing countries more than probably it affects the US because of their vulnerabilities, because of their credibility issues and so on. It may, and then we start observing this. Again, in India, there are this sort of cockroach movement party and then they're uprising and so on. But the second uncertainty, I believe, is a concern for the economists, for technocrats. We don't really know how to measure this immediately, the impact of AI. And as long as this continues, this two uncertainty continues, central banking will be difficult in the years to come. And that's why, let me conclude with the central bank independence. When there are more uncertainties around, probably there is only option left to us is to trust our policymakers, and not necessarily politicians, but we want our policymakers to be more in coordination with the politicians, because it's not the time that you want to risk. Because the main function of the central banks is to provide certainty, such that people will invest and so on. But now, given that there are certain 19 uncertainty or some sort of unmeasurable things that even for the central banks, it might be even a better time to even coordinate more with the policymakers. And we will see, but these two uncertainties will remain with us for the upcoming months and years. So let me conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for three distinguished speakers and for insightful sharing from different perspectives. I'm going to raise one question, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&As. I think this question is probably more for the historians. We have two or maybe even three on this stage. We talk about independence a lot, right? So we're talking about the central bankers' independence within the economic political system. Kevin Walsh is one we've talked quite a bit, including not communicating about the guidance. And how would that withdrawal of communication affect the second piece, right? Uncertainty in the financial market, in the landscape. So that's one independence of the central banker within one economy. The second one is my own question, right? When we face all the challenges, for example, the war, different countries, different central banks are responding very differently. The US central bank hasn't changed interest rate yet. The ECB increased by 25 basis points and give a guidance. Maybe there's another increase. While Singaporean MAS, we have some government agents here, just increase the exchange rate rather than the interest rate. So we have some change in anticipation of the inflation pressure, right? So does this look like a divergence? How does this differ from the early days, like from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, in terms of the collaborations and orchestrations among central bankers in the world, including the US, European, and emerging markets? So I'm going to open this question to all three of the speakers. Thank you.
So I think it's appropriate that different central banks are responding differently. Singapore is a very open economy, so the exchange rate matters much more than the dollar exchange rate matters to the Fed, given that the US is a relatively closed economy. I agree with what was said about how this is an exceptionally difficult time for central banks because they're facing a supply shock from the energy market, and there's nothing worse for monetary policy than a supply shock, which is both inflationary and recessionary. There's all that AI issue of what this implies for collaboration among central banks, I would answer not very much. The days of international agreements like the Plaza Accord of the 1980s are over. The days of international policy coordination, given our fraught geopolitical environment and U.S. administration, are over. The best we can hope is that central banks, even if they're not going to share as much information with the public as they did in the past, at least share information with one another.
Well, I think it's hard to disagree with Barry about things like that. I suppose the supply shock problem, like, I've never really worked out what I think ought to be done. In principle, what policy ought to be followed in the presence of a supply shock. So if I go back again to the 1980s and the advocacy of central bank independence, it seems to me they weren't thinking about supply shocks. The inflation target, which emerged, or the story that inflation is the only thing that mattered, seems to me to presume that all the shocks were demand shocks and probably caused by the policymaker. It's not obvious to me that ideally one would be targeting inflation in the presence of a supply shock. And we told the central banks to target inflation, and they take it more or less seriously, as the case may be. But I think it'd be interesting to consider that. As to the uncertainties all around, well, I suppose, in principle, that makes it a case for a less discretionary policy, a more rules-based policy. My monetarist chums in the UK would surely say that the reason one targets growth of the money supply is precisely that it works out all right. It's not because it works out wonderfully, but in the presence of uncertainty from all over the place, it works out all right and better than you're going to do by trying to solve every intricate problem that comes along. So, well, I don't know if I want to go there myself, but there is a thought that arises in this uncertainty.
So, this central bank independence discussion, I mean, I'm not an economic history, but as well as I know, it is a post-Second World War idea. I mean, we never thought too much, I don't know, please correct me, I'm not that proud of familiar before that period. But central bank independence is mostly a post-Second War Goodwill environment story, right? Or even more of 1980s, after 1980s. But now, look at US, for example. They start having more interventionist trade policies. They decide they redefine the supply chain, especially in the AI-related fields where they have technological advances. And these are very structural policies. And when you have strategic industrial policies, let's say, right? And then we all know, even for the Koreans, they have been invited to, or they have been forced to open up microchips companies in factories in US. Same thing for the other microchips companies. The Korean export was about 25% was coming from microchips to US and other countries, but they have been forced to open up and not to sell it to China. And there are this sort of all trade and industry related policies. And in a sense, the countries are becoming more united within against the other countries. And this was the regular history of the world, probably. What we experienced after the Second World War, more liberal order and so on, overall might be an exception. So that's why probably we will be speaking less about the central bank independence. So it will be more of a collective decision by the countries and in dealing with other countries. So central banks will be definitely involved there. This is my thing. And also, again, it differs. For example, that's why I wanted to give the example. Central bank independence still matters for high inflation countries. Because if you don't reduce your inflation at least to the single-digit numbers, then you cannot talk about other structural issues, about how to get help from the central bank for the industrial policy or dealing with other countries, or even with the payment policies of Agora and British and so on. That's why the countries with the low inflation rates, like Indonesia, like South Africa, and so they have the more of a luxury of experimenting different central bank independence. But for Turkey, for Argentina, I believe there is not much room there.
So I didn't know we were having a panel on central bank independence, but since we are, I would like to correct the record. This is really a rather old concept. It was called central bank autonomy, and it was championed by the League of Nations in the 1920s and by the Princeton University money doctor Edwin Kemmerer in the 1920s when the Great Depression and then World War II came along. It kind of went by the board and was reestablished with long and variable lags, if you will, after World War II. So the Fed regained its independence in 1951 at the end of the Fed Treasury Accord period. The Bank of England regained its independence in 1997. That's a long country-specific lag reflecting circumstances. If we talk about central bank independence, we ought to talk about central bank accountability as well. There is no independence without accountability, and that's another reason why I'm a little bit uncomfortable about Federal Reserve chairs who are not willing to speak clearly about what their policy intentions are.
It is good that we have economic histories, otherwise I will not be corrected. But my point was that really global order is changing. There seems to be a new global order emerging, and certainly it will affect how the central banks and the policymakers are interacting. That's good to know that.
Barry, of course you're quite right about all that. But I think there is a distinction that when the question of central bank independence emerged in the 80s very prominently, it was nice to get a different idea from Kemmerer's, I think. Kemmerer wasn't thinking about open market operations and macroeconomic management, but that's what the focus of independence was about in the 1980s. So similar words, sorry, I would rather agree that it's in its the current way we talk about it is a newer question than the one that Cameron and his colleagues were discussing.
All right, I think it's probably proper time to open the questions to the floor, and we have mics in the audience.
So thanks to the panelists for some provocative and interesting comments. My question, though, is directed at Barry. So you hinted that what might happen next depends on the way in which we might have to think about coming off dollar dominance. And I want to give you a particular scenario to see what you think. And tell me if you think this is not the right analysis, but I would have thought the biggest threat is the US fiscal position. It's premised on AAA-backed treasuries. If we get to a world where people lose confidence in the US fiscal position and things unravel from there, do you see that as a plausible scenario? It's not, or even a likely scenario, I don't think it's likely. But then does it affect which of those alternatives you think people will retreat to, or will there be just some other alternative that perhaps the international organizations have to get involved in doing in that world?
I think I would generalize the point a little bit. It's not only if the dollar loses its centrality in the global monetary and financial system, it will be because of economic and political missteps in the United States. And those can result from an explosive trajectory for the debt to GDP ratio, threats to the independence of the Fed, questions about U.S. geopolitical alliances. We know that central banks and others hold and use the currencies of their alliance partners because their alliance partners are viewed as reliable. Will the U.S. be viewed as reliable in Europe and Asia going forward? So I think it's not only fiscal, but it's more broadly irresponsible policies in the United States that could lead to diversification away from the dollar as reserves in use in payments and so forth. And my worry is that if this were to occur abruptly and soon, there would be nothing else to fill the gap, and then you would be in a liquidity shortage scenario, like you were in the 1930s when sterling reserves were liquidated after sterling's devaluation in 1931. Dollar reserves were liquidated after the three banking crises, and trade credit became harder to source. Foreign exchange market intervention became harder to finance if it were to occur abruptly and soon. That's not a scenario that I lay out here, but that would be my fear.
Let me add one more fear to this, actually. My fear is not on the fiscal side. My fear is on the stock market side. And you look at all these technology-related investments, especially on AI, there seems to be some sort of a bubble there, but we don't know whether it's going to burst. And we are all financing it through stock market, through different channels in the and the interactions of this IT companies, like NVIDIA is investing in OpenAI investing in this and then. So there is a kind of a very interesting relations between these AI companies. And if it bursts, we are, what will be the reaction of the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve will not let the stock market to collapse. And this can be another step for this miscalculation. Right now, globally, we are financing the AI companies in the US, and all the central banks, all the sovereign wealth funds, all the private equity companies are actually investing in the US. And this is also another threat, I believe. And that we can have something like 2008 crisis if we don't see the productivity gain from this AI investment, which is, I believe, still uncertain.
So, not to be alarmist, but you noticed the Kospi, the Korean Stock Exchange, fell by 10% yesterday. And the headline in my edition of the Financial Times was, banks demanding additional collateral from hedge funds. So your scenario may be coming faster than you thought. This may be the excuse Kevin Marsh needed to cut interest rates.
Any other questions from any of the, yes, there's one more, and then we'll conclude this.
Hi, thank you for giving me the chance. I'm Masudar Sanadin. So my question goes to Professor Ahmed. As you mentioned that when there is a more kind of uncertainty, so it is better to believe the policymakers rather than politicians. I agree with this. On the other hand, you also mentioned that the forward guidance, which is essentially being ignored more prominently by the Fed. So my argument is that don't you think that when there is a kind of uncertainty called geopolitical risk or geopolitical tensions, which more often leads towards the supply shock kind of uncertainty. So here the role of central bankers are more towards controlling the shock side, supply side shock rather than means since central banks are more capable to control the demand shock rather than supply. But when there is a supply shock from the geopolitical shock, then it is more, we can say, responsibility of the central bank to focus on the forward guidance so that they could control the, for instance, the macroeconomic objective of price stability and all. So it seems to be counterintuitive that over time forward guidance is going to decline. But on the other hand, when we are facing the supply side shock, then the responsibility of central bankers coming more in terms of giving the forward guidance. So what is your take on that?
Thank you very much. First of all, in any uncertain case, forward guidance is also very difficult. So that's why I said for the Fed, there could be two reasons. It can be because of the political reasons that he doesn't want to intervene or doesn't want to deal too much with Trump. He doesn't speak that much, that's why he doesn't want to give the forward guidance. Or it can be really the uncertainties about AI, about so Same thing for the developing countries. For developing countries, forward guidance is given because the main pillar of stability in the developing countries is the exchange rates. When there's an exchange rate issue, then it gets into first inflation issue, financial, everything follows up. That's why there's a fear of floating, for sure. That's why in Indonesia, for example, why they raised the interest rate recently, because there was an exchange rate volatility, and they have to show that they are behind the exchange rate. That's why it is different for developing and developed countries, first of all. That's why I'm saying that we should probably rethink this central bank independence thing. I believe Professor Barayangri gave a very good example. It is a kind of a multiple equilibria. It depends on the politician, and also it depends on the character of the governor, even how the governance structure is established. And it's a very delicate balance, because there are lots of shocks coming, like the supply shocks, technology-related shocks. That's why the first what I want to emphasize, there has to be more coordination between the politicians and the central bankers. For example, I remember in the past the central bankers do not even want to talk with the politicians because they will be exposed to political intervention. But now, probably we should even talk more with the politicians, and we should try to convince them. And we should even make, central bankers generally do not want to interact with the politicians that much because it becomes a political quarrel. But in this sort of uncertain environment, it is the responsibility of the central bank governor and the team to communicate the shocks, communicate their circumstances more transparently, such that they will convince the overall public and the politicians at the same time. So I believe there has to be much more coordination in the increasing uncertainty environment, especially for developing countries and probably even for US right now, because of the new Fed chairman. Probably he should even speak more about the AI-related uncertainties, global-related uncertainties. Probably they are already talking behind Trump, but it may not help all the time.
Thank you very much.
That's very true. Thank you. Actually, I also agree with you on this point that nowadays they are saying this privileged communication. So consecutively, when the central banks fail to target inflation, then they don't reveal the report, and they said that it's a privileged communication between the central bankers and the government, and they don't disclose the report to the public. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. So we're a little bit out of time. Let me ask each speaker to give a 30-second answer. What do you see different? One of you has to give me something bright. So for the policymakers, is there anything brighter today relative to the history we know? Or one advice, 30 seconds maybe. I know it's very complicated now. We talk about many fears, right? Anything a bit different. So Barry, start first. I only ask one person to give something positive. You don't have to do that.
I don't know. I think we're in one of those periods when technology is changing rapidly, and that creates opportunities as well as risks.
Thank you.
Quite right. The optimistic thought is that the AI might work out the way the advocates say. Why shouldn't it? That's terrific.
All right.
I was a bit more pessimistic about the CBDCs, the AI, the government's controlling, but at the same time, the technology may help for more transparency and reaching out to the right people on redistribution and so on. I'm hopeful. Thank you.
That's a beautiful ending note, right? Let's hope technology to do the magic, so we have the hope that the central banks and the world can still function. The economy is going to be growing, and hopefully we don't run some serious systematic risk in various markets. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
All right, thank you, Professor Jin Young.